Hi, my name is Angelica, and I will be going over the four stages of cognitive development from Jean Piaget.
Hi, my name is Chrissy Myers. I am the research lead for this project, and I looked at Freud's Oedipus complex.
My name is Sierra Heinrich, and I am the other research lead for this presentation, and I will be going over Freud's psychosexual stages of development.
My name is Jaden Linehan. I am the presentation lead, and this is our presentation on Freud's psychoanalytic theory and Piaget's theory of cognitive development.
This is Sierra Heinrich, and these are the stages of psychosexual development. Sigmund Freud developed his theory of the unconsciousness and personality and then extended it into a theory of psychosexual development. In 1905, he wrote 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, where he discussed his views on psychosexual development and infant sexuality. This is a part of his psychoanalysis method where he dives deep into the client's underlying problems. He believed that our personality is shaped through the experiences we have throughout infancy and childhood. In this theory, these experiences are divided into stages, and in each stage, we are working on the development of our ego and libido. The libido is the source of our sexual energy and a biologically vital component of ourselves that we must learn to cope with in all areas of our development. These stages also represent different psychosexual conflicts that we must overcome in order to reach the next stage of development. And if we do so, we can then have a healthy adult personality. According to Freud's theory, the conflicts that are within each stage are correlated with an erogenous zone, mouth, anus, and genital region, which are areas of the body that are particularly sensitive to erotic stimulation. These zones are the focus of each stage and an outlet for the infant or child to meet his or her needs developmentally. Children can become frustrated from the lack of needs met, or can experience overindulgence from the abundance of met needs, both resulting in the child's libido struggling to enter the next stage. This leads to what Freud calls fixation, which is a behavior that correlates to a particular erogenous zone that the person engages in an attempt to relieve anxiety. The first stage is the oral stage. Just moments after a child is born, they're encouraged to nurse at the breast, and it is with this interaction between mother and child that the oral stage begins, according to Freud. During this stage, the mouth is the source of libido energy. The infant develops a sense of trust and comfort in their mother through nursing, and also through other oral stimulation such as sucking, exploring objects with their mouth, eating, etc. This is also where it is said that the foundation of our ego is developing as the infant brings stimuli in and out of their senses independently, leading to the formation of our judgment and concept of reality. The infant eventually experiences a phase where they are weaning off the breast and less dependent on the caretaker, which is all part of normal development. However, if fixation occurs during this stage or some other type of upset in normal development, this is where Freud claims that it will show later as an oral character personality type in adulthood. As the child starts to enter adulthood, this fixation comes out through certain behavior. Examples of this behavior would be biting nails, smoking, chewing, or overeating. Around 1 to 2 years old, the infant begins to wean off the breast and they enter the anal stage. This is where the libido shifts from the mouth to the anus as the child begins toilet training, and the anus becomes the erogenous zone in primary focus. The child is learning to become independent, and one of the most celebrated achievements at this age is their ability to use the toilet. An expulsion and retention conflict occurs during toilet training, and he or she needs to decide whether to go with the parents' demands of them to be able to control when they go, or act upon their desires to relieve themselves when they choose to. If during this process the child is punished for their decision or has some other negative experience with toilet training, they can experience fixation, and it is this drama between parent and child that leads to the anal personality, which many of us have heard of. The anal personality is either retentive or expulsive type, which type depends on the parent's responses during toilet training. Examples of the anal expulsive person include being messy, disorganized, or defiant, and those of the anal retentive person include being careful, meticulous, orderly, or passive aggressive. Between the ages of 3 and 5 years old, the child enters the phallic stage with the resolution of the anal conflict. The phallic stage is a very crucial part of sexual development as the libido shifts to include the genitals. The child becomes curious of themselves and of others and begins making comparisons and asking questions. Along with this newfound curiosity, they also begin to develop what Freud considers to be the Oedipus complex. He believes that without resolution of the Oedipus or Electra complex, that the child will stay fixated in this stage. This results in the phallic personality, who Freud believes will struggle with sexuality in adulthood and is behaviorally reckless, narcissistic, vain, self-assured, etc. The latency period comes when the child is between 6 and 11 years old. This is a time in the child's life where, after resolving the phallic stage conflict, they shift their focus from sexuality and their bodies to being more social and interested in cultural happenings around them. Because their sexual interest lies dormant during this time and is replaced with socialization, Freud considers this the latency period, not a stage in psychosexual development. Any eroticism is manifested in their social life and academics. They are working towards a sense of competency, and their time and energy is spent developing their interests. The final stage is the genital stage, which occurs around 12 years old or the onset of puberty. Adolescents experience the reemergence of their sexual feelings as their bodies begin to physically mature. The erogenous zone is focused again on the genitals as the individual's interest and attention turns towards preparing for a heterosexual relationship, according to Freud. Also, according to Freud, if the individual has successfully resolved all these conflicts in the previous stages, then they have the emotional foundation to become a healthy adult. He believes that this stage finalizes the transformation from a selfish, pleasure-seeking infant to a sexually mature and socialized adult with a well-established concept of reality. These individuals essentially have the tools that they need to socialize with others, to develop a relationship with someone else, and to prepare themselves for marriage and raising a family.
This is Chrissy, and I'll be talking about the Oedipus complex. According to Clocker's article entitled The Oedipus Myth, The Tragedy and Strengths of Oedipality, the best-known version of the Oedipus myth is Sophocles' Oedipus the King from 425 BCE, mostly because it was written down. Briefly, the story goes that Laius was cursed by the gods that if he had a son, that son would kill him and marry his wife. Laius and Jocasta did have a son, Oedipus, and, at Laius's urging, Jocasta agreed to get rid of him after he was born. Oedipus was adopted by a king and had a happy childhood. However, when he was a young boy, the oracle told him that he would kill his father and marry his mother, and Oedipus did not return to his adoptive parents because he still thought of them as his parents and did not want to harm them. He journeyed to Thebes and along the way met Laius, whom he killed in a fight. When he arrived in Thebes, he destroyed a sphinx by answering her question correctly and was given Queen Jocasta as a wife to thank him for getting rid of the sphinx. When, after having 4 children together, the truth is finally revealed to Oedipus and Jocasta, she hangs herself, and he blinds himself. As our textbook explains, the Oedipus complex occurs during the phallic stage of psychosexual development when children are between 3 and 6 years old. According to Freud, the basic parts of the Oedipus complex are the desire to have a sexual relationship with the opposite sex parent and hostility toward the same sex parent. And, as Kupferschmidt states, Freud believed it to be the source of all neurosis. Shankman adds that the Oedipus complex is very important to personality development and that its successful resolution requires the child to identify with their same-sex parent, which allows the child to eventually move into the genital stage of psychosexual development and develop their superego.
My name is Jaden, and I will be focusing on the psychoanalytic theory regarding its structure of personality and ego, id, and superego. Psychoanalytic theory suggests that unconscious forces act to determine personality and behavior. Freud believes that people are unaware of their personalities and the specific characteristics within their personalities, which he uses the term unconscious. Examples of these unconscious characteristics can include desires, demands, infantile wishes, and needs that are hidden from conscious awareness because of the disturbing nature that they are able to express. He also believed that the unconscious is responsible for a majority of an individual's everyday behavior. Freud points out 3 specific pieces to detail his theory of psychoanalysis. Structure of personality is labeled to identify these 3 points, including ego, id, and superego. Ego is rational and reasonable and acts on a reality principle. Ego is said to act as a buffer between the primitive or primary, id, and external world. Ego operates based on what is called the reality principle, which is defined as the instinctual energy restrained to maintain an individual's safety as well as to help integrate that person into the real world and society. The reality principle also plays the part of using practical strategies to gain its necessary satisfaction. Ego presents itself through the different stages as the child grows and matures, which helps it differentiate itself from id. Id is the unborn part of personality that is present at birth and within the oral stage of development. Id is described as raw and unorganized characteristics that represent primitive drives relating to irritation impulses, hunger, aggression, and sex. Lance and Ray, from my 2021 source, states that id is the instinctual aspect of the psyche and consisting of sexual and aggressive drives. It essentially is the biological, instinctual, and unconscious drive of the individual as it is involved in gratification. Id is even more compared to ego in the fact that id operates off of the pleasure principle. The pleasure principle is defined as the attainment of a goal of reduced tension and immediate maximized satisfaction. Freud believed that the pleasure principle was in relation more with the nature of synthesis than of speculation, and that it also had ambition's aim. On page 12 of the preface of The Ego and the Id, Freud says, "I am conscious, however, that it does not go beyond the roughest outline. With that limitation, I am perfectly content." Now on to superego. Superego is an individual's conscious that makes the distinctions of right and wrong. These distractions are made by the incorporations of morals and values expressed within society and culture. Freud states the superego begins its development towards the end of the phallic stage, which is around the age of 5 or 6. Superego is learned characteristics from those who play a significant role in that child's life, such as parents or teachers. Freud believed that the unconscious is part of the personality that a person, and therefore their consciousness, is unaware of. It has been stated that 3 parts of individuals' personality are also identified as defense mechanisms to the subconscious. As we age, these defenses persist through each phase and evolve with each individual over time. Therefore, if you look at each stage and at each of the three structures regarding personality, you can see each of them as the child grows to an adult.
Hello, my name is Srunika, and I will be talking about Piaget's research on people's grasp of consciousness. Piaget started looking into consciousness, the stream of consciousness, and how oneself interacts with physical objects, people, and oneself very early on in his career. In fact, it's not his most well-known works, as he soon moved on to his theory of his stages of development. The recurring theme of consciousness is studied from two different perspectives. It looks at the point of view of the observer and the behavior or psychological aspects of a study, and also looks at everything in relation to the subject. Piaget claimed in his research that our grasp of consciousness is inherent to life itself. This means that according to Piaget, without the grasp of consciousness, we wouldn't be able to function so normally on a day-to-day basis. Parts of our stream of thought would be lost. According to Piaget, we have a grasp of consciousness when childhood has reached the point of development where he or she successfully performs an activity and knows how he or she did so. For example, Piaget would say that a child has reached full development in a grasp of consciousness if they complete a task and they're able to explain how and why they successfully completed the task. In his more refined works, Piaget went back and reconstructed his proposal of consciousness to include schemas. These are mental frames where we fit information to organize the world around us. We grow to develop these schemas into concepts. For example, fruit. We build a fruit schema for ourselves, and over time, association comes into play. This is where certain things fit into that schema, such as apples, pomegranates, or mangoes. For Piaget, the basis of consciousness can be understood as the understanding of how oneself interacts with the world around them. Piaget's interests and findings with his grasp of consciousness research is coherent with his theory of cognitive development, as he proposes that the sequence for the grasp of consciousness also goes into particular action and then moving forward to representation before finally reaching the operational stage. He also states that the grasp of consciousness always involves an action being conceptualized, therefore always requires reconstruction in our thinking and the way we organize our schemas and associate things with one another. This means that in order to develop the framework for the grasp of consciousness, we must always be thinking and shifting our thinking to adapt our current environment and take in new information. This also means that even though the grasp of consciousness was early research in Piaget's career as a developmental psychologist, we can begin to see the correlation between his theory of grasp of consciousness and his stages of development. In addition to this, in his research, he states that in order for someone to truly develop a grasp of consciousness, it requires the problem to be solved by cognitive means and no longer the material means used to solve them. For example, according to Piaget, If somebody has truly developed a grasp of consciousness and they had a problem of, say, leaking water from the ceiling, they would first start by brainstorming the multiple ways that you could solve the problem rather than looking for tangible resources at hand before thinking of a solution. In the bigger picture, it claims that people who have a grasp of consciousness have a strong tendency to think before they act. Piaget also states that grasp of consciousness occurs through the mental reconstruction of a physical activity through two mechanisms: majorant equilibrium and reflecting abstraction. He believed that without these two things coexisting progressively in the future framework for the entire development of a child into adulthood, their process of development could be jeopardized, meaning that it takes both the ability to do something while being aware that you are doing that particular thing and the ability to reflect back on that same thing to develop a full grasp of consciousness. In addition to his research on the grasp of consciousness, Piaget also clearly distinguishes between three levels of conscientiousness. The first being material action, which takes place without conceptualization. The second being conceptualization and material action taking place at the same time. And the third being conceptualization guiding material action, which goes back to the example that I gave earlier about the problem of leaking water and thinking before a person acts when presented with a problem or objects. In other words, Piaget believed that with a stream of consciousness developing, the first level would be to see objects and have objects and play with said objects without really realizing what they do or how they interact together. The second would be to have a concept of what the objects are and still have the objects and play with the objects, but not exactly use the objects for how they were intended to play. And the third would be to use one's own conceptualized understanding of what the objects are and to let that guide how they use the objects. I would like to end by saying that the grasp of consciousness was research that Piaget did in the very early stages of his career as a developmental psychologist. These early stages of his works are very important because they have led us to the stages of development that are still practiced in today's psychology. As I referenced earlier, Piaget's stages of cognitive development are a more tangible reflection of his research of the grasp of consciousness, as the levels and stages of grasp of consciousness can be seen through the stages of development.
Hi, my name's Angelica, and I will be going over Piaget's stages of cognitive development. First stage is a sensory motor, which occurs between 0 to 2 years. This is when infants learn about the world through their bodily sensations and muscle movements. There are 6 substages to sensory motor development. First one would be simple reflex. It occurs between birth and the first month. This would be when coordination of sensation and action through reflexive behavior. Examples would be rooting, sucking, and grasping reflexes. Next one is first habits and primary circular reactions. This occurs between the first and 4 months. This is coordination of sensation. There's 2 types of schemas: habits, which is the reflex, and primary circular reactions, which is production of an event that initially occurred by chance. Their main focus would still be on themselves, on their body. Examples of this would be when they repeat a body sensation that they first experienced by chance. For instance, like when they suck their thumb, then they might accommodate the action by sucking their thumb differently from how they suck on nipple. Next one would be secondary circular reaction. This usually occurs between 4 to 8 months. Infants become more object oriented. They move beyond self preoccupation. They repeat actions that bring interesting or pleasurable results. For instance, infants will coo to make a person stay near them, or as the person is leaving, the infant starts cooing again to get their attention. Next one would be the coordination of secondary circular reaction. This usually occurs between 8 to 12 months. This is a coordination of vision and touch, hand-eye coordination. Examples of this would be when infant manipulates a stick in order to bring an attractive toy within reach. Next one would be the tertiary circular reaction, novelty and curiosity. This usually occurs 12 to 18 months. Infants become intrigued by the many properties of objects and by the many things they can make happen to objects. They experiment with the new behavior. Examples would be a block can be made to fall, spin, hit another object, and slide across the ground. Last one would be internalization of schemes. This usually occurs within 18 to 24 months. Infants develop the ability to use primitive symbols and forms during mental representation. Examples of this would be when an infant who has never thrown a tantrum and before who sees a playmate throw a tantrum. The infant will retain that memory of the event and then himself will decide to throw a tantrum the next day. Next stage would be the pre-operational stage, which occurs usually between 2 to 6 years. This stage is when children begin to represent the world with words, images, and drawings. They also use symbolic thoughts, go beyond simple connections of sensory information and physical action. Their stable concepts are formed, mental reasoning emerges, egocentrism is present, and magical beliefs are constructed. There's two substages that this stage is divided into. It would be the symbolic function substage and the intuitive thought substage. Symbolic function substage usually occurs roughly between 2 to 4 years. Child gains the ability to mentally represent an object that is not present. This will expand the child's mental world. Thought has two important limitations, egocentrism and animism. Egocentrism, the inability to distinguish between one's own perspective and someone else's perspective. An example of this would have been the experiment, the Three Mountains task, which a doll was placed on one side of the mountain. The child was shown a few pictures of the mountain from different angles and was supposed to select which angle they think the doll would see. In that experiment, the child would always pick the picture of what they see, not what the doll would see. Animism is the belief that inanimated objects have lifelike qualities and are capable of action. Example of this would be the symbolic drawings of young children. So when young children do drawings to an adult, it would be scribble scrabble. But to them, it's whether they try to draw a dog or a dove. That's what they see. Next one would be intuitive thought substage. This occurs between 4 and 7 years. Children begin to use primitive reasoning and want to know the answers to all sorts of questions. Children seem so sure of their knowledge and understanding, yet are unaware of how they know what they know. A couple questions that kids might ask would be, what makes you grow up? Who was the mother when everybody was a baby? Or why do leaves fall? Why does the sun shine? They start asking all those why questions. The third stage would be concrete operational. This would be between 6 and 12 years. Children can reason logically as long as reasoning can be applied to specific or concrete examples. One of the examples would be conservation of matter. So it's an example where there's two glasses. One is slim and long, it has water, and the other one is short and fat, and it has water as well. They both have the same amount of water. But to a child, it would be that the slim, tall one would have more water because it seems that that one has more than the short, fat one. This stage also allows children to consider several characteristics rather than focusing on a single property of an object. Would be seriation, the ability to order stimuli along a quantitative dimension. So there's big sticks and little sticks. They will be able to tell which ones are the big ones and little ones because they physically could see them in front of them. Next one would be transitivity, ability to logically combine relations to understand certain conclusions. So when they're looking at these big sticks and little sticks, they're able to see that A, B, and C, that A stick is longer than B and B is longer than C, therefore A is longer than C. The last stage in the cognitive development would be the formal operational. This occurs when they hit their teenage years up until they become an adult. This is when teenagers acquire the ability to think logically about abstract situations. They conjure make-believe situations. They abstract positions and events that are purely hypothetical and can try to reason logically about them. For instance, going back to that ABC stick problem from concrete, they would actually be able to solve this problem through a verbal presentation instead of having to have the sticks in front of them to be able to see the problem. Assimilation dominates early, speculations about ideal characteristics, qualities they desire in themselves and others from what they see adults began to think more as a scientist thinks. They devise plans to solve problems and systematically testing solutions. Hypothetical deductive reasoning involves creating a hypothesis and deducting its implications, steps that provide ways to test the hypothesis.
This is Jaden, and for this slide, I will be discussing the modern importance of Freud and his theory on the structure of personality. The structure of personality, as Freud defined it, is still a largely considered and researched factor within psychology over 100 years after he published his theory of psychoanalysis. His daughter, Anna Freud, was another psychologist who expanded on his theory. The expansion that she contributed was the identification of certain terms, followed by what they can be defined as, or the situation or disorder that they can be expressed during. These terms that Anna defined embody the characteristics of ego, id, and superego. The terms in regard to primitive defense mechanisms can include acting out, avoidance, conversion, denial, projection, regression, and more. The defense mechanisms that are labeled to be of a higher level include anticipation, compensation, displacement, humor, rationalization, reaction formation, sexualization, sublimation, suppression, and more. Proof of the multitude of how prevalent Freud is within all of my sources, but specifically Wong in 2015 article makes a statement: moral philosophers interested in Freudian theory come very late in the 20th century, and it was not until the early 1980s that systemic discussions of the relationship with moral philosophy began to emerge in the English-speaking world. Wong also makes the statement of, however, their assessments of Freud's moral thinking differ, and there is no fully developed moral psychology to which the predicate psychoanalytic can be applied. Over the length of his career, Freud had a multitude of theories, ideas, and theoretical works that he published and idealized. The theory of psychoanalysis and its structure of personality, featuring ego, id, and superego, was actually his last. This is important to modern times as well as the field of psychology because he offers a complex description of the mind and how it works. When he came up with this theory, it was considered new and revolutionary. And even though it was considered revolutionary, the smaller, unconscious ideas can be seen within his previous works in regard to its insights, innovations, and synthesis. Freud and his works are still important and utilized in modern times because of how his brain operated, therefore allowing future generations of psychologists to the knowledge on the capacity of how their brains operate, whether or not they agreed with his theories in the end. And lastly, the way that Freud and his theory of psychoanalysis and the structure of personality are important to this class is provided for a multitude of reasons. These factors are important simply because of the name of the class, the history and systems of psychology. Freud is considered to be one of the greats in the field of psychology, who has also revolutionized the way that we believe the mind operates.
Surprisingly, there are still articles being written today about the Oedipus complex. Freud's version of the Oedipus complex required two parents of opposite sexes. But in the 21st century, many families do not look quite like that. In the article Classic Psychoanalysis and Male Same-Sex Parents, Sigmund says, quote, "Developmental theories have created the myths of our era. Among other things, they define the normal family and normal gender roles. Classic theories assign psychological functions by sex," end quote. However, Schenkman argues that the Oedipus complex can and does occur in all types of parent-child relationships, because it is not about gender, but about primary and secondary caregivers, with the traditional function of the mother being played by the primary caregiver, and the traditional function of father being played by the secondary caregiver, regardless of gender. According to Schenkman, psychotherapy can make use of the Oedipus complex to, quote, "analyze issues of authority, aggression, and sexuality without resorting to the binary division that assigns certain functions to the man and others to the woman," end quote. Even in 1989, Britton described the Oedipus complex as, quote, "a prototype for an object relationship in which the child is a witness and not a participant," end quote. He also uses the term Oedipal triangle to describe the relationship among parents and their child, which sets up the more modern view nicely. Heinemann, who looked at female same-sex parents, discusses the movement from dyadic to triadic relationships. That is, relationships between two people to relationships among three people. When children realize that they are not in exclusive relationships with their parents, that their parents also have a relationship with each other that excludes the child, and the child accepts that, they have resolved their Oedipus complex. Clockers elaborates on these relationships, stating, quote, "although the baby is at first in dyadic relationships with both mother and father, and establishes a place in a new triadic relationship, the child in a healthy family also remains outside the couple's original relationship," end quote. Despite these more modern views on the Oedipus complex, which make it seem relevant, Kupferschmidt writes in 1995 that therapies that acknowledge the existence of the Oedipus complex and therapies that do not acknowledge the existence of the Oedipus complex are equally successful, and concludes, quote, "there is little reason to believe in the existence of the Oedipus complex," end quote. However, There is one field where Freudian analysis is not considered outdated or of questionable usefulness, and that is the field of literary criticism. Psychoanalytic theory is largely based on Freud's ideas, but it also draws heavily from Jacques Lacan, French psychoanalyst who tried to get back to Freud's methods by way of structural linguistics, and was expelled from the International Psychoanalytic Association in 1953 for unorthodox analytical practices. In the field of literary criticism, whether or not something is considered relevant in today's world isn't as important as whether or not it reveals something new about the text one is reading.
Psychoanalyst and philosopher Erich Fromm argued that all psychologists need to understand Freud, even though everything he said was wrong. If many of Freud's theories are heavily criticized today for being too vague, too hard to test, or simply wrong, then why is it relevant today? Though there are many who are critical of Freud's psychoanalytic theory today, there's no doubt that he made major contributions to modern-day psychotherapy. His theory on psychosexual development represents a foundation for describing normal and abnormal personality development as one concept, and he paved a path for others to create definable stages for the development of personality. Though many of his theories are rejected today, people still can't help but ponder about them as he challenges us to consider what is going on in our unconscious mind. The truth is, though, Freud's theories are outdated, and the contemporary stance is just that. This comes to no surprise, though, being that Freud died over 80 years ago, and these theories have evolved into ones that are more scientifically supported. Sexuality is a normal part of life, and it often comes with conflict of some kind. However, most therapists do not focus their treatment on the lost memories and fixation in childhood because there are more scientifically backed explanations for these problems. Diving into the reasoning behind phallic symbols and whether or not a client has a fixation derived from the Oedipus complex is simply just old news. However, Freud still has stood the test of time as an influential psychologist and has brought us to the point we are today with psychodynamic thinking, and his legacy will continue on as we move into a new age of psychology with hopeful findings in cognitive neuroscience.
This is Jaden, and I will be discussing the contemporary view of Piaget's theories of development. Many preschools and primary programs are modeled on Piaget's theory. There are two primary instructional techniques. They're recommended by parents and teachers, and the children's abilities are challenged, but the material presented does not go too far beyond the child's comprehension level. The teachers use a wide variety of concrete experiences to help the child learn, and examples can include working in groups to set different perspectives, as well as field trips. This is Jaden again, and I will now go over why Piaget and Freud's theories are important issues regarding the history of psychology. Jean Piaget developed a very influential theory of cognitive development. He also added to our understanding of children and their intellectual growth. And lastly, his research methods were based primarily on case studies.
Sigmund Freud and Piaget both share the title of being stage theorists, but there's no doubt that Piaget's theory of cognitive development is more widely accepted today. Piaget studied Freud's work and was first exposed to the depth of his theories after experiencing them firsthand with Sabina Spielrein, undergoing psychoanalysis with her. Piaget decided it wasn't for him, but was able to take away inspiration for his version of his theory of development, where he breaks down children's cognitive development in stages instead. When compared to Freud's psychosexual stages of development, we find many similarities, but more so differences. Piaget and Freud's stages both look at a person's growth of reality and the development of adult personality or their sense of self. They share the belief in examining an individual's childhood in effort to better understand the adult. They also both believe that when you are young, you are developing a moral sense of judgment and work to construct it throughout your childhood. However, this leads us to more where their beliefs differ, as Piaget thought morality is based on the child's development of reasoning, and Freud understood this process to be based on the development of the superego. Looking at Freud's psychosexual stages, the focus is based on a primitive and sexual nature. Freud believed that for development to advance to the next stage, that the individual must overcome a libido-type conflict within themselves, and this conflict resolution begins in infancy. Piaget, on the other hand, believed that for children to mature and progress through life, that they need to learn by adapting and exploring the world around them using their sensory and motor skills.
Although Freud may not have explained it this way, his concept of the Oedipus complex is actually very similar to Piaget's idea of egocentrism in children. The Oedipus complex occurs because children are learning that other people, specifically their parents, have relationships that do not involve the child, and it resolves around age 6. Egocentrism is the state a child is in before they realize that other people do anything that doesn't involve them, is a hallmark of Piaget's pre-operational stage, and also ends about age 6. The major difference, of course, is that Freud believed this egocentrism revolved around wanting to have sex with the opposite sex parent, and Piaget's concept of egocentrism has nothing to do with sex.
Their theories also differ with their aspects of personality development. Freud believed in the id, ego, superego concept as a necessary part of development, whereas Piaget's concept of egocentrism was a necessary construct. Their theories can also be looked at comparing who plays an influential role in a child's life. Freud believed that the Oedipus-Electra complex or parental figures influence them. Piaget, on the other hand, believes that children are rather heavily influenced by their peers. The methods in which they collected their data also differed greatly. Freud's psychoanalysis was all about his interpretation of the conversations that took place between the client and the therapist through the process of free association. Piaget gathered his data by directly observing, interviewing, and interacting with children. Both Freud and Piaget's theories of development have been heavily criticized by modern-day psychology. However, Freud's more so, with his work being said to not consider cultural aspects, failure to directly observe children, and inaccuracy due to overuse of the involvement of sexual feelings. However, both have greatly influenced future theorists to look more deeply into the development of children. Piaget and Freud are relevant today because of their theories continuing to serve as a foundation of methods that have helped so many children to be better understood and receive the proper care and attention that they need at home or in school so that they can lead a healthy, normal life as much as possible. Discussion questions. Number 1, why do you think we still talk about Freud even though, as Erich Fromm said, everything he said was wrong? Number 2, a common criticism of Piaget is that his work is based on the observations of his own 3 children. How would you respond to this? And that concludes our presentation on Sigmund Freud and Jean Piaget's theories of development and consciousness. Thanks for watching.